Welcome to my presentation on using brain science to guide education. Anyone who knows me knows that I love my research. When I first embarked on writing a book, I quickly became aware of just how much research was required to check the facts and ensure that what I was putting down on paper was the latest and best version of the truth that the research would be able to substantiate. Around the same time, I started Spec Training, which is a registered training organisation, and we specialise in vocational education. And it became apparent quite quickly that a lot of what was being espoused, specifically in the business and education training packages, needed some scrutiny and perhaps a sceptical eye. So in this presentation, I'd like to address the applicability of recent neurological and psychological research into learning and how it can be applied by yourself and your students. Why? So we can all ensure that students and teachers aren't sidetracked by fads and unsubstantiated claims about teaching techniques and otherwise commonly practiced beliefs. So we're not tempted to waste precious time and resources on fancy sounding ideas that can often hinder or at worst harm a student's ability to learn. And additionally, foster the techniques that do work and effect meaningful change on those fortunate enough to be in such a learning environment. So let's start with this one, as it's one of the most prevalent learning myths out there. So prevalent, in fact, that most of us accept it as implicitly true without stopping to check if it's right or wrong. Unfortunately, there's no evidence to show that this theory holds any weight. People like to think that they have a specific learning style, and some may even have learning preferences. The most common understanding of learning styles is associated with the predominant senses used to assimilate something new. These are, of course, auditory for oral or heard information, visual, verbal, sometimes called linguistic learning, kinesthetic or physical learning, and reading, which is a subcategory of oral. There are also models that tend to look at the way we process information as well. So these include logical, social, also known as interpersonal learning, and solitary or intrapersonal learning. Because of their strong experiential links, we find it impossible to dispel these ideas and can think of a number of reasons why these do apply. But consider the role of confirmation bias in these beliefs. The bias strengthens our belief because we can immediately think of anecdotal examples of learning in these different contexts. But the research has failed to replicate consistent styles over time, citing that the learner will in fact prefer different styles depending entirely on the context and or content of the new information. Do learning modes impact learners with a disability? Absolutely. This is not a myth. Rather, it's just a realistic necessity of an individual's situation and needs. The general approach for teaching more effectively with science in mind is to remain aware of multimodal delivery and assessment methods, as the positive effect on learning is proven. The brain has a better chance of remembering something when the inputs are varied among the senses. So learning to ride a bike can be purely physical, but in conjunction with an appropriate explanation of momentum, balance, and mechanical forces, and perhaps watching another person ride a bike, the rider will assimilate more information and thus have the opportunity to learn the skill better. So lastly, catering to those preferences does not show any learning benefits. In fact, it may hold learners back if it's not encouraging them to strengthen other ways that they have of absorbing information. None of which is to say that we shouldn't provide material in a range of styles. The benefit of offering a variety of information is that it leads to richer learning experiences for everyone. This is a very controversial topic for some people. Many of those who have read the descriptions of being right or left-brained have come to identify with those descriptions strongly. So for them it feels true, therefore it must be true. Telling them that actually we use our whole brains equally feels like a direct attack on that part of their identity. Not only is there no scientific basis for the idea that left-brained people are more analytical while right-brained people are more creative, scientists haven't even been able to find any evidence that people use one side of the brain more than the other at all. In retrospect, this shouldn't be surprising. After all, the world is rife with examples of mathematical geniuses who are also highly creative, or artistic geniuses who are highly methodical. And while certain people might be more or less creative or methodical, we shouldn't pigeonhole them by designing our courses to play to unfounded learning biases. The right brain, left brain theory originated with the work of 1981 Nobel Prize winner Roger W. Sperry. He studied brain functioning in patients who had their corpus callosum, the structure that connects both hemispheres of the brain, severed as a treatment for epilepsy. But these patients also experienced other symptoms after that communication pathway was actually cut. For example, they found themselves unable to name objects that were processed by the right side of the brain, but were able to name objects that were processed by the left side of the brain. Based on this information, Sperry suggested that language was controlled by the left side of the brain, and in further observation it was found that the right side tends to handle those spatial information and visual comprehension tasks. But as I've said, more recently, it's been confirmed that no matter how lateralized the brain can get, though, the two sides still work together. And they revealed that while activity was sometimes higher in certain critical regions, both sides of the brain were essentially equal in their activity on average. You've probably heard that you can't teach an old dog new tricks, but as it turns out, there's plenty of evidence to show that we retain our brain plasticity as we age, meaning your older students are just as capable of learning as your younger ones. More importantly, these audiences want to learn and feel frustrated when they're boxed out of the educational market simply because that market assumes they won't use technology, for instance. But they can and they will, so long as you let them. A great example of the ability of older people being able to learn is in the research around language studies. Learning a native language as a child has a number of advantages, not the least being the full submersion of that child within the language. As an adult, we have to cope with competing cognitive loads, work, home life and more. And this leads to distractions, study commitment issues, mindset problems and more. But the problem isn't with the brain. It is more than capable of learning new languages if the stakes and circumstances are ideal. In his book Ultralearning, Scott Young proved just that by immersing himself into a number of different cultures to focus on learning each new language. The result was that Scott was able to learn 4 languages within an extraordinarily short period of time. Now let's talk about how we actually remember. Some of these steps may be familiar to you from previous presentations, with the one difference possibly being point 1, retention intention. This is the learner's desire to learn. We then encode the information using a mental construction based on our sensory inputs. Then we take that information and store it in short-term and hopefully long-term memory. But we're not aware it's even there until we try to recall or retrieve that information. There's evidence that students' attitudes, both individually and collectively, as well as their self-perceptions as successful learners or not, has one of the largest effect size impacts on outcomes. While not the only factor, if students think they are not going to be successful, this leads to the self-fulfilling prophecy of failure. On the other hand, if a student has a growth mindset, an open attitude towards new experience, and believes that they can and will learn with the appropriate effort, then that student typically does well, which has also been shown in online settings. This suggests that attitude, even more than aptitude, plays an important role in learning outcomes. In related research, there is strong evidence that self-regulation and other executive functioning skills account for almost double the impact of native intelligence-related learning outcomes. This means that being able to focus on a task and stick with it are more important than just being born smart. It also means that a good attitude towards the new online learning modality is vital for successful learning. According to Dr. Carol Dweck, a growth mindset can be fostered by applying some new habits. These are reflection, to embrace failures and learn from them; knowing your purpose, either for the short term or long term, depending on the task; taking on challenges that push our learning envelope; fostering grit, that ability to persevere; incorporating the word yet into our vocabulary to avoid words like can't, won't, or never; and having written goals that are reviewed regularly, because this also helps with that purpose step. Professor Tracy Tokuhama Espinosa from Harvard University Extension School says that using teacher-constructed quizzes, employing colourful, well-designed training materials, small group interactions and facilitator-led discussions all improve the quality of your session. But don't just do it for the sake of it. Consider how each activity leads to a better experience for the student before committing to it. In my experience, what things look like has a visible impact on student attention. That said, an even more recent study found that using stick figures on a whiteboard is better than having a high-quality image in a textbook, as learners enjoy the activity of watching the teacher draw out their story in front of them. So it pays to remain focused on the quality of the whole experience and the interactions and training materials. According to the findings of the University of Queensland's Science of Learning Research Centre, consider the flow of your session. Does it take students from what they already know to what you want them to know after the session? For example, if I'm teaching someone about critical thinking skills, I'll discuss what they know about critical thinking and ask how they've applied it. Then I'll show them the models and ask them if they can see how the models relate to how they may have approached things in the past. This encourages the students to want to know more, as they can relate the knowledge or skills to future experiences. There is a link between positive emotion and memory encoding. Celebrating a correct answer or showing empathy towards a student who is discovering a new topic while making errors along the way helps to reinforce that learning by improving perceptions, paying attention, and problem solving. Celebrating a win can be as simple as offering words of encouragement, congratulating a student on an improved outcome, or applying those active listening skills to really hear the thoughts and opinions of the student before offering a suggestion. Finally, what is it that's exciting about your industry? What is coming up in the future that might excite the student to want to be a part of it? For example, I might share that the future of leadership in Australia has been reported to be in the hands of those who have advanced critical thinking skills. Leading in your field means faster promotions, wider responsibilities, interesting challenges, and increased social value among your peers. Memory encoding converts information into a construct that's stored in the brain indefinitely. The process begins with perception, which is the identification, organization, and interpretation of any sensory information in order to understand it within the context of a particular environment. So stimuli are perceived by the senses, and then related signals travel to the thalamus of the human brain, where they're synthesized into one experience. The hippocampus, a part of our lizard brain if you like, then analyzes the experience and decides if it's worth committing to long-term memory. So encoding is achieved using chemicals and electrical impulses within the brain. The neural pathways, or connections between the neurons, the brain cells, are actually formed or strengthened through a process called long-term potentiation. This alters the flow of information within the brain. In other words, as a person experiences brand new events or sensations, the brain rewires itself in order to store those new experiences in memory. There are four main types of encoding: visual, acoustic, elaborative, and semantic. And while it's not vital to remember these names, it does favour a vocational educator to know how to address them generally. Visual encoding stores what we see for a fraction of a second in our iconic memory, and then it's moved to longer-term memory for storage. The amygdala, which is right down the base of our brain, plays a large role in the visual encoding of what we learn. Acoustic encoding is the use of sound to record what is being learned. This is aided by a thing called a phonological loop. This is a process by which sounds are subvocally rehearsed, basically saying it in your mind over and over in order to remember it. Elaborative encoding uses information that's already known and relates it to new information being experienced. The nature of a new memory becomes dependent as much on previous information as it does on new information. A good example of elaborative encoding would be trying to remember somebody's name who you've met for the first time. And let's say their last name is Fisher. Then a method to elaborate that word might be to view the person holding a fishing rod. Studies have shown that long-term retention of information is greatly improved through the use of elaborative encoding. So finally, semantic encoding. It uses sensory inputs that have a specific meaning or can be applied to a context. For example, you might remember a particular address based on a nearby street name, or maybe a particular text by the smell of a library. Educators can use things like chunking and mnemonics to aid in semantic encoding. Let's quickly review chunking and mnemonics. Chunking is a process where individual pieces of a set of information are broken down and then grouped together in a meaningful chunk. The chunks are grouped in order to improve short-term retention of the material. It basically bypasses the limited capacity of our working memory and allows learning to be more efficient. Chunks of information are able to be retrieved more easily than a disorganized rabble of individual pieces due to their coherent familiarity. This means that each piece of information relates to the other in some way, thus connecting them not only on paper, but in the way our brains actually encode them. It is believed that individuals create higher-order cognitive recollections of these items within the chunk. The items are more easily remembered as a group rather than individual items themselves. Beware, though, that chunks can be highly subjective. This is because they rely on an individual's perception and past experiences, and how they are able to be linked to the information chunk. The phenomenon of chunking can be observed in the way individuals group numbers and information in their day-to-day life. For example, when recalling a number such as 10092021, if numbers are grouped as 10, 09, and 2021, our brains create a mnemonic for this number as a day, month, and a year, and it would be stored as September 10th, 2021 instead of a string of numbers. Another important concept of chunking is what we call periodic chunking, the time that we limit to each delivery mode. According to psychologist John Medina, these chunks of information should be limited to 20 minutes to fall in line with the results of research into the ability of people to maintain attention before needing to change a delivery mode. That is, going from, say, a lecture to an activity, or problem solving to discussion, and so on. Mnemonics, on the other hand, are simple learning strategies that can be modified to fit a variety of content. This method enhances memory of complex words or ideas and promotes better retention of the material to be learned. Mnemonics are separated into three types. Keyword, where a familiar word is adapted to resemble a more difficult word or concept, such as using the word face in music theory to remember the whole notes on the open lines of a treble clef. There are also peg words. Peg words are simple rhymes or alliterations that are used to recall the key words, such as legs 11. It substitutes numbers for words to exploit our general preference for narrative concepts over mathematical ones. And finally, letters, where letters are used to spell out a recognizable word where each of the letters begins one of the key words being taught. In vocational education, my favorite example of this is VACS, V-A-C-S, for the rules of evidence, which are valid, authentic, current, and sufficient. We'll revisit chunking and mnemonics a little later and actually provide you a little test, and then we'll review that test at the end of the session. Not all information is encoded equally. So if information is improperly coded, recall will later be more challenging. The process of encoding what is to be learned in the brain can be optimized in a variety of ways, and they include things like mnemonics, chunking, and what they call state-dependent learning. Just briefly, state-dependent learning is where people remember more information if their physical or mental state is the same at the time of encoding as the time of recall. This is closely related to context-dependent learning, where the physical environment plays a large part in the student's ability to recall information. So in both situations, it is ideal for us as educators to be conscious of the emotional environment in which we are teaching and how this might impact our learners. And if we intend to teach a transferable skill, then we should avoid learning in just one strict environment. So I'm going to give you something now that you'll be tested on later, so by all means try to remember this. And this is using the word test, T-E-S-T. What does it stand for? Test. The T stands for tell the student what they need to know. T is tell the student what they need to know. E is evaluate their responses. S, systematically review each response with the student. And T is tell them how they can improve. TEST, tell, evaluate, systematically review, tell them how they can improve. See if you can picture that in your mind for a moment. At the end, I'll test you out and see if you can remember what TEST stands for. Before we get on to what to do, let's start with what not to do. The 4 examples I've got here, which I'll run through in a moment, are based on psychological, educational, and neuroscience research. So let's start with point 1. Do not mix speaking with reading tasks. Simply put, the part of the brain that deals with reading is closely associated with the part of the brain that deals with speaking. So if you want a student to listen to what you are saying, make sure you don't have something in front of them that you're either asking them to read or that they may be tempted to read while you're talking. For example, having a textbook open while you're trying to go through some complex information may prove to be too much of a temptation for the student. They may decide to read ahead, look for the answer to questions that may be coming up, and therefore not focusing their attention on what you're saying as their teacher. A common mistake that we make is to have a PowerPoint slide with the text that attracts the focused attention of the student while we're talking. So unless we're affirming what is written on the slide, their brains will struggle between listening to you and reading the information that's on that slide. Instead, they will shift their attention between the two, and as we'll see in a moment, that leads to poorer retention. Do not jump between topics without linking them by using an experiential tool such as a story, example, demonstration, or questions. Again, if we think about how the brain works, there are different centers dealing with logic, emotion, experience, planning, and so on. If we have a student's focused attention, then generally speaking, these centers work together to create a constructed memory of what you're teaching. But when you jump to a new topic without an effective segue, students can be left momentarily to try and form their own connections between the previous topic and the new topic. In this moment, it's quite easy for a student to be confused or be left behind when you start your new topic. So by creating an effective segue, such as using a story, example, demonstration, or even questions, the student is led more effectively from what you've just been talking about to the new topic. Point 3, do not expect your students to multitask. So as I inferred in point 1, multitasking is actually a problem when it comes to learning. People who are generally more effective at multitasking, or as we should refer to it, switch tasking, are so because they've spent more time practicing their skill and therefore have generated stronger pathways between the centers of their brain which required them to move from one task to another very quickly. So professions such as pilot, chef, even childcare worker tend to be better in these instances. But the general rule that we want to apply here is to avoid learning situations where students must do a variety of tasks at once, unless it forms a key part of the role that they're learning. Point 4 is to not overload your students. Cognitive load theory has been around for decades, yet we haven't assimilated it into our curricula for a variety of reasons. Cognitive load theory simply states that when a person reaches their limit of working memory capacity, they can feel overwhelmed and stressed, which leads to poor decisions and even poorer retention. The theory tells us that when teaching students new content and skills, teachers are more effective when they provide explicit guidance accompanied with practice and feedback, not when they require students to discover for themselves many aspects of what they've learned. What to do? By encouraging discussions and problem-solving tasks between students, the encoding of new information is expanded to include more senses, different parts of the reasoning centers of the brain, as well as overall engagement. In a 2017 article, students reported that discussion and problem-solving activities increased engagement, helped retain and remember information, confirmed what they had already learned, provided clarification of prior learning, and deepened their understanding, especially through hands-on and application-based learning opportunities. Active retrieval requires that the teacher ask questions regarding the content that has been taught, to allow students to actively reinforce that learning. These exercises should be regularly planned throughout a training session to act as milestones for key teaching points. Examples of active retrieval include things like quizzes, short answer tests, and other direct questioning techniques. Like problem-based learning, inquiry-based learning encourages students to investigate solutions to open questions and has a range of advantages. But the pedagogy must be shaped by research-backed approaches to reap these advantages. So, from a student's point of view, inquiry-based learning requires them to use evidence-based reasoning and creative problem-solving to reach a conclusion, which they then must either defend or present. From a teacher's point of view, inquiry-based teaching focuses on moving students beyond just general curiosity into the realms of critical thinking and understanding. It encourages students to ask questions, and it's the teacher's role to support them through the investigation process, understanding where to begin and how to structure an inquiry activity. So methods can include things like case studies, group projects, research projects, field work, and unique exercises that are tailored to their students. Now, we've talked about chunking in terms of keeping concepts consistent, but now we're going to look at chunking whole sessions. The concept has been around for over 20 years, but recent research has developed key learning that you can apply, such as 1. Limit each phase of his session to no more than 20 minutes. This is the limit on average that an adult can stay focused in a particular learning mode. And 2. Change the mode, not necessarily the content. So at each interval, change the mode of learning using some of the practical tasks or activities from the inquiry or discussion-based techniques. And finally, the last tip to improving encoding is to monitor and respond to every student interaction during a learning activity. When a student asks a question or infers that they are struggling with a concept through their nonverbal cues, a high-performance educator will identify the need and respond effectively. So this means asking the right questions to identify the problem and then following up with questions that prime the student's memory to better connect their new learning with existing concepts. We can probably all recall occasions when an answer to a question we asked in class was actually one of the most poignant moments we were able to recall. We've now covered retention, intention, and encoding. The next phase of learning is storage, both short-term and long-term. Due to their nature, we're going to cover both storage and recall at the same time. Our brain doesn't store information like a computer. There are no specific drive locations we can just tap into to recall a specific fact or movement. Instead, our brains store memories in an intricate system of pathways that change depending on environment, sensory inputs, and experiential relevance. So as educators, our goal is to tap into this understanding to enhance the way learners store information for longer periods of time, and so they can recall the information when required. Here are just a few tips, starting with the use of forced recall activities. A number of studies have shown that how well a learner remembers soon after learning provides no assurance of how much will be remembered after a week or longer delay. In these studies from 2008 and 2016, optimal learning occurred when an initial learning session included repeated study and forced recall testing of all items at least 4 times in a row. Now, this may be impractical and labor-intensive for even the brightest learner, but the bottom line is, 1. Just looking over learning material can be ineffective for long-term memory. 2. Right after learning an item of information, forcing oneself to recall it and check to see if you got it right works. And lastly, 3. Conduct forced recall testing of all information, not just the items that were previously recalled correctly. The way I run this activity is usually at the morning break, lunchtime break, and afternoon break of a full day course. And then the morning of the second day if it goes to another day. I simply instruct the group to recall as many key points from the previous session as they can in no particular order, and I usually put a time limit of 2 to 3 minutes on the activity. We then get the students to compare notes, and it's usually very instructive to see that most people remember different things depending on how they interacted with the class, either the questions they asked, the problems they solved, or just the notes they took. This highlights the effectiveness of forced recall not only as an activity for the individual student, but to the other students participating in that same activity. Forgetting to remember is my way of remembering to use regular breaks to give the brain a chance to consolidate new learning. The forgetting part actually refers to actively changing the subject, or better still, practicing a little mindfulness or meditation to remove the focus from the learning points. Working memory is something we use every day, and it makes our lives a lot easier when it's stronger. For most adults, there is a maximum that we can hold in our working memory. But if you're not quite using your memory to its capacity, meditation is one thing that can help to strengthen it. Research has shown that participants with no experience in mindfulness meditation can improve their memory recall in just 8 weeks. Meditation, with its power to help us concentrate, has also been shown to improve standardized test scores and working memory abilities after just 2 weeks. So why does meditation benefit memory? Well, it's somewhat counterintuitive, but during meditation, our brains actually stop processing information as actively as they normally would. The skill of regular practice then shows that ability actually enhances focus and concentration when it is needed. Mixing up the context of the learning uses a technique called interleaving. This is a learning technique that involves mixing together different topics or forms of practice in order to facilitate the learning. It's sometimes referred to as mixed practice or varied practice and is contrasted with things like block practice or specific practice, which involves focusing on just a single topic or form of practice at a time. So interleaving has been shown to facilitate people's learning in a variety of domains, both when it comes to theoretical and physical-based learning tasks. Because interleaving can be such a beneficial technique, it's worth understanding it. Some examples include using different tools to get a specific job done, practicing a skill in component parts rather than all the way through from start to finish, and mixing theory and practical tasks into one session, and so on. Interleaving works because it helps learners overcome something called contextual interference, where the brain is forced to learn by creating new pathways around the interference, and another system called discriminative contrast, where the brain is forced to recognize similarities and differences between the concepts they're trying to learn. Lastly, sleep. Sleep is not an essential after learning something new, but research has also shown the benefits of sleep prior to learning something new. Biologically speaking, sleep is the mechanism by which memories are stored into longer-term centers of the brain. While there is conjecture over the exact mechanisms at play here, many researchers believe that the function of the brain waves during both deep sleep and REM sleep assists the allocation of memories from short-term to certain longer-term parts of the brain. And while there is still much research to be done, the evidence for sleep is solid. Good sleep improves memory encoding and memory storage. In the area of improving your sleep, I can't recommend the book Why We Sleep by Matthew Walker any more highly. There's some great tips and a lot of facts around why sleep is important to us. It's a skill that not only you can benefit from, but also your students. So let's jump back and test our recall. The word test, what does it stand for? Have a think about it, T-E-S-T, and write it down. So how did you go? Interestingly, this test was actually flawed intentionally. Firstly, there was no scaffolding applied around the word test. It was a random word with no additional meaning or context provided, and therefore it wasn't very interesting. Secondly, it was only delivered verbally, with no instructions to write anything down, leaving only your auditory pathways the job of planting a memory. So, if you did remember it, the chances are that you enjoy a challenge and probably did write it down, or you paused the presentation and used your sub-vocalizations to say the content over a few times. So thank you for your attention during this presentation. For tips to improve recall, like positive and negative priming, associative priming, and perceptual priming, I'll leave a number of links in the description or handouts relating to this video to resources for further improving your teaching and assessment practices.